Public affairs, politics, opinions, and discussion. This is The Issue on YourTV. I'm Mark Carr. On this edition of The Issue, we'll be celebrating National Indigenous Peoples Day. But first, I'd like to introduce our co-host, Wendy Rinella, CEO of the Oakville Community Foundation. Wendy, I'm going to turn it over to you to voice your land acknowledgement, and then we'll talk about the introduction.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Mark. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Oakville lies on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Anishinaabe. We're also on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are part of the Great Anishinaabe Nation, specifically on two treaties of allyship, Treaties 22 and Treaties 14. Treaty 22 is under a land claim, which we spoke about earlier in the year on this program with Chief LaForme. Because this is National Indigenous Peoples Day, I also want to acknowledge that the reason we do land acknowledgements is to recognize our colonial history and also to recognize the long-standing relationship of our Indigenous neighbors to the land, and also to educate ourselves more so about some of the atrocities that have happened in our country. And we need to be ever present and knowledgeable about these issues. And to help us along the way, we're so fortunate today to have Stephen Paquette, who's a local knowledge keeper. And in the appropriate Indigenous cultural way, he is going to introduce himself. Stephen?
Excellent. Ani miigwech Wendy. Good day, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself in a more fitting way that would be traditional to Indigenous people. And I shared this because within our Indigenous worldview, we see all relationships as being sacred. And that's just not being important or very important, but above all others. And what we're told by our elders is that if we're going to have any kind of relationship, that we want to make it the absolute best. So I would like to introduce myself in the following way, if I may. Stephen John Paquette Gijnikaj. Gijnikaj is simply an Ojibwe word that means my name is. So we start off with Ani, hello, Stephen John Paquette Gijnikaj. I was born John Andrew Kimawan. I share that with you because I'm a product of the 60 scoop, but I know who I am and I want to acknowledge that. I also have a spirit name. My spirit name is Bamanse Bamatwindinase Gijnikaj, which translates into he walks a good life. Traditionally, all First Nations people had spirit names, but that's something that we lost through the process of colonization and something that we're trying to work back to. Makwa Dodem. Makwa meaning bear, Dodem meaning clan. I'm of the Bear Clan, and in stating that, I know my roles and responsibilities. I come from Wikwimikong, unceded territory up on beautiful Manitoulin Island up in Georgian Bay. My nationality, I'm not Canadian, I'm Anishinaabe. That is my nation of the original nations here on Turtle Island. And when you hear me refer to Turtle Island, what I'm talking about is North America. In my community, I have been I'm a traditional pipe carrier. I am a former Eagle staff carrier. In my journey, I have been a police officer. I have been a social worker. Now blessed with the opportunity to be a teacher. I am a son. I am a father. I am a grandfather. I am a brother. I am an uncle. I am a storyteller, and I like to think that I'm a friend to many people.
Miigwech, that means thank you. And one of the things that I know and I'm always surprised by is how little Canadians know of traditional Indigenous languages. We'll go and travel to to Mexico, and people can come back and say a few words in Spanish, but yet we don't know some of the traditional languages. And I know that there's over 630 First Nations, 5 Inuit dialects, and of course the third Indigenous nation is the Métis. So we have those 3 groups, and they're all represented here in Halton Region. So Stephen, I know that this is a really difficult time since the uncovering of the 215 graves of the residential school children in Kamloops, some identification of further graves, up to 500 in other residential schools. I think there's about 130 residential schools across Canada that have been identified. And you recently wrote an article in the Toronto Star. Can you share with us the thoughts that you had in that article for our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. Miigwech. It's an article that I wrote to the Toronto Star, and it was Canada Day is not a day to celebrate for Indigenous people. It's a day of mourning. And, as we look at the recent unmarked graves that have been found in British Columbia and are starting to be found across Turtle Island here. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. But we can't look at this in isolation. We have to look at it in the context of colonization. These unmarked graves that were found at residential schools, right? And, for me in the article, I take it all the way back to, and here's a little bit of a history lesson for everyone, is that in some of these things that I want to share with you are not in our textbooks, unfortunately. And what we have to do is we have to look at the mindset of the European explorers when they first came here. In our textbooks, we're taught that they were looking for a passageway to India. They were looking for new lands. But we often overlook is what was their mindset when they came here? What was their mindset? And if we look back in history, we go back to something called the Doctrine of Discovery. And I believe that was issued by Pope Nicholas V, if I'm not mistaken. And what we have to remember is back in this time in Europe, that the church ruled supreme. And when a pope issued a papal bull, that it was almost as if he were speaking for God himself. And in this papal bull, the Doctrine of Discovery, what this particular pope had said to all these Christian European countries that were going out to explore new lands is that if you find lands inhabited by non-Christians, that you have the authority and the obligation to convert them to Christianity. Now, if they don't want to be converted to Christianity, then you have the authority and the obligation to enslave them. And if they choose not to be converted, and if they choose not to be enslaved, then you have the authority and the obligation to kill them. That was the mindset of these early Christian European explorers. And we have to think about that in terms of power and privilege. When we look at those three things alone, that's power and privilege. We move over to when the Europeans came here and they started changing the names of the First Nations. And a name is important. A name is part of our identity. It's part of who we are. The word Iroquois was never spoken here on Turtle Island before the French came. Why? Because they weren't the Iroquois. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse, because the name means something. The Cree called themselves the Mushkego. The Huron were not the Huron, they were the Wendat. For my nation, the Anishinaabe, the original people. So when you look at these maps, when you look at textbooks, for the vast majority, these names were not the original names. And that was part of colonization, removing one's identity. Next, we come up to the treaties. And the treaties, I want to take a look at how our societies were. And again, unfortunately, this doesn't get much ink and paper in the textbooks, but most of our First Nation societies were matriarchal societies. Female-led, female-dominated. We had great respect and reverence for females. Yet in Europe at this time, it was a patriarchal society. And they brought those attitudes with them. And they disrespected our females. So they turned our societies upside down. And what some people say is that when we look at the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women, that it stems all the way back to that. Then we go on to the change of our forms of governance, which comes back to females. In most First Nation societies, we had something called clan grandmothers, who were a major part of our form of governance. Yet when the Europeans came with their patriarchal attitudes, they dismissed the females as leaders, the ones that should have been involved in treaty making. Then we go to the treaties. And when you think about it, Canada is a country that was born through treaties with the First Nations people, right? Yet these treaties, they were not conducted in a good way. For the first 250 years, the Europeans participated in our Wampum Belt Treaty, our traditional customary form of doing treaties. But after 250 years, they got tired. Why? Well, because it was different. And they didn't like things that were different than the way that they were. So they dismissed our Wampum Belt treaties as being uncivilized. Then when you think about it, being given a treaty, an agreement to sign in a language that you don't understand, is that fair? That's how Canada was born, on treaties that the First Nations people didn't understand. And one would say, well, then you just need translators. And that's great. We did have translators. For the French, they were called coureurs de bois, men who came over. They didn't represent France, but they came over here and lived amongst the First Nations people. But what we have to understand is that the translators had a bias towards their homeland. That's what Canada was born on, right? And then all throughout the treaty process, right? Something that we didn't understand. We thought that we were sharing the land and territory. Then we come up to July 1st, 1867, the creation of Canada. And this is where I'd really like people to focus on, is that Canada Day is not a day to celebrate for Indigenous people. It's a day of mourning. With the creation of Canada, and when we think about that, lands that were created, a new nation that was created on the lands of First Nations people without their consultation or consent, that's what Canada is. When we think about Canada, which formalized the act of colonization through the Indian Act, which created reservation systems that we were not allowed to leave without permission from the Indian agent, restricted our freedom of movement. And the Indian agent, somebody who controlled every single aspect of your life. You couldn't even go to the nearest town for groceries without the permission of the Indian agent. And what was the role of the Indian agent? To remove all of our culture. You couldn't speak your language. You couldn't practice your ceremonies, your traditions, your ceremonies, all of those things, to remove our culture. And then, of course, from we have the reservations, we have the Indian agent, we have the Indian pass, and then we have the gift of education. Mm-hmm. That's how it was presented. Residential schools. And when that didn't work, the government wasn't done yet. They were committed. So then we had the 60 scoop that still exists to today. And we still have consistent underfunding of all Indigenous projects from the federal government that exists to today. So this is why I wrote this article to the Toronto Star. And I just wanted the people to understand that Canada Day is not necessarily a day to celebrate for Indigenous people.
Stephen, I appreciate all of that history, and you're absolutely right that our textbooks, our schooling should respect the actual history. But when you're talking about Canada Day, and I understand from your perspective how you feel, how do you feel about everyone else? Are they able to celebrate Canada's birth with the Indigenous people in mind? I'm just wondering how you would expect the rest of the country to celebrate it, or should they celebrate it?
Great question, Miigwech. Thank you, my friend. I think it's a day to acknowledge. We can acknowledge it. It's like Remembrance Day. We don't celebrate Remembrance Day. We acknowledge it. And when I look at Canada, from my perspective, I certainly think that it's a day to acknowledge. It's a fact. It's a fact in history. July 1st, 1867, Canada was created. There's no way around that. That is an absolute historical fact. And if people choose to acknowledge it, as I acknowledge a historical fact, I think that that's fine. But I think it's extremely difficult, if you understand the history, to celebrate versus acknowledge. And I'm on the same line when I look at things like I was invited to participate in a discussion on a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald. And I said, let's keep the statue up. It's a historical fact that Sir John A. Macdonald was the father of Confederation. You can't take that away from him. But let's also add the fact that he was the father of cultural genocide and helping to implement the residential schools. When we study history, it's supposed to be unemotional, unbiased, and I can acknowledge that Sir John A. Macdonald was the father of Confederation. Don't have no problem acknowledging that. But to put it in a larger context, which is what I think that we need to do as we go forward unearthing Canada's history.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that's a really healthy perspective. I guess for some of us, there's a great national narrative that we're this open and welcoming country to people from around the world. And of course, we're now seeing exposed not just the racism towards our Indigenous neighbors, but to a variety of different groups, notably how COVID has impacted racialized communities in Canada and police aggression towards racialized communities. And I'm just wondering, with that national narrative, how do you see us having a more robust national narrative about our history? There is that aspect that we do welcome refugees, but we also have to acknowledge the other tragedies that are part of our history.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Wendy. It's interesting. And again, I come at this through an Indigenous lens that I find it difficult in all that Canada does to welcome newcomers to Canada, as I welcome them to Canada. But I struggle in the national narrative of how we have so many Indigenous issues that have yet to be addressed, from murdered and missing Indigenous women to boil water advisories to underfunding through education and health, all of these things. So as an Indigenous person, I really struggle with this. And it's interesting. I've had some great conversations with newcomers to Canada that I've warmly and personally welcomed. And as I go through and I explain Canada's history, they weren't aware of this. And they said that, when they were preparing to become Canadian citizens, they never learned all of these things. And they were disappointed. They were sad. That they were given a different bill of goods, if you will, in their understanding of it. And I think as all Canadians, we have a responsibility to understand our history, Indigenous and non-Indigenous history. And again, we study history for the purpose of learning the good, the bad, and the ugly. What did we do great? What did we do not so well? What do we need to improve on? What did we do, the work that still remains to be done?
And speaking to that point, Stephen, do you find that Canadians are moving towards the thoughts that you have brought forward? Don't you see some progress being made? And I would think, from my perspective, that the progress is fairly great in my lifetime, from the scoop to where we are today. I think we have moved ahead very rapidly. What would be your thoughts on that?
Great. Thank you, my friend. Absolutely. We have made tremendous progress. I would not necessarily say rapidly, in terms of all the things that we're finding out. And as this story of the residential schools starts to unfold, that there is going to be more stories coming out. One of the things that distressed me greatly was when the Ontario government stopped the implementation of Indigenous education in the curriculum. I was fortunate enough to be a part of the curriculum writing team. And we were very much looking forward to coming back together and working on the curriculum, and that was stopped by the provincial government. And, had that not happened, maybe the story of the unfound graves in the residential schools, maybe it might not have been news right now, because we would have been teaching this in our curriculum at schools. And as I know with many of my students, they take great pride and pleasure in sharing what they learned with their parents, who acknowledge that this isn't what they learned in school. So they always enjoy those conversations. So in answer to your question, yes, we are making progress. Maybe not as rapidly, but that's okay too, because sometimes when we walk too fast, we trip. So we need to walk with purpose.
Thank you, Stephen Paquette. I would like to share that I've had the pleasure of working with Stephen for over 5 years now. And one of the things the Community Foundation did with the help of Stephen and other local Indigenous leaders was build the moccasin trails, and in Oakville. There's one in the north and one in the south. And Stephen was also helped us agree to fund the Medicine Wheel Garden at Sheridan College. And we have a live performance when we have community classroom actually operating of Visions of Turtle Island, which grade 8s go and see, and the grade 5s walk down the moccasin trails. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, Stephen, what would you like to see happen? In addition, we know that we worked on getting the town to fly the flag of the Mississaugas at Town Hall. We worked on a number of other issues. I'm just wondering, what would your request be of some of the things that you'd like to see in the town or in Halton region? Let me go out to all of Halton.
Good. I like that. And again, I want to acknowledge all the beautiful things that we've been able to accomplish together in Oakville with all of our community partners, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Certainly the raising of the Mississaugas flag on a permanent basis at Town Hall was a big one. To have a land acknowledgement at the front doors of council chambers at Town Hall in Oakville, the Moccasin Trail, the work that was done down by the lake, exploring the Indigenous history. And, my hope is to expand this to the rest of Halton. I think that Oakville has certainly been a leader, not just in words, but in action. And when I say in action, that has always been in consultation with Indigenous people. One of the beautiful things that I love about all of our partners in Oakville is that consultation, because we have people that sometimes through good intentions, and they start a project and then they'll kind of come at the end and they'll say, can we get your stamp of approval? So my message to anyone out there that wants to do something, to help build that relationship, and also to be a part of that truth and reconciliation journey that we're all on together, is to consult with the local First Nations community in your area, whether it's in Georgetown or Acton or Burlington, to consult with your community to make sure that it's done in a good way. But for me, I would love to see the flag of the Mississaugas credit in every town in Halton. I would love to see the region as an entirety to have that flag up at their regional offices. That would be my first significant goal that I would like to see accomplished.
I know they just passed something at regional council, but I haven't read it yet.
Yeah.
I'm working on a relation with Chief LaForme, so hopefully we'll see that soon. Who's the chief of the Mississaugas of the credit? Something.
I do have one more thing. And,
okay.
This might catch some people unawares because I haven't had full conversations with them. But, one of the things that I would like to do is, my good friends at the Halton Region Conservation Authority, they have a piece of a land. It's not really accessible, and it's called the Glen Orkey Conservation Area. And what I would love so much is to see that conservation area renamed. In some way, shape, or form, acknowledging the Mississaugas of the credit. Because what people don't know is that the Mississaugas have always had a connection with the water. It's part of their history. And where they're at now, they've lost that connection with their history, that connection to the water. So one of the things that I would like to see is perhaps is the renaming of that from Glen Orkey to something either representing First Nations or more specifically the Mississaugas of the Credit, because all First Nations would have used that creek running through it as part of their travels to get down to the lake. So that's my next.
Ashquizing. That's the Indigenous name.
Yeah.
I'm probably mispronouncing it, but I know it's Ashquizing.
Yeah.
People don't know the Indigenous names of this community, which is really quite tragic as well.
Stephen, we just got about a minute left, and I really want to say to you, I appreciate what you bring to the table, and we should always sit down and talk with one another when we're implementing any sort of program. So I appreciate your what you bring to the table, and I appreciate you being with us today.
Mark, if I may say, reconciliation, the definition is long-term mutually respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, not box checks, and that's really the goal. So just to close on that note, and to thank my friend Miigwech, Stephen.
We're going to take a break for the summer. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our many producers this season: Joey Ricconte, Anthonly Luongo, Tina McEwne, and today's producer, Brad Scott. We greatly appreciate their expertise of each of these producers and what they've brought to the issue. And I'd like to thank John Sawyer, my co-hosts, John Sawyer, Kim Slainwhite, Angelo Bentevegna, Deb Tymstra, and of course, our co-host today, Wendy Rinella, for their insights and dedication and hard work this season. We'll be back in September. So on behalf of the producers and my co-hosts, we'd like to thank our loyal viewers for joining us each week, and remind you that you can watch The Issue Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. with repeats throughout the week and throughout the summer on YourTV, truly local television. Enjoy your summer. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. See you in September.